400 million years ago, the tallest living thing on Earth was not a tree, not a plant, and not an animal. It stood nearly 9 meters tall, dominated entire landscapes, and remained the largest organism on land for tens of millions of years. More than a century and a half after its discovery, scientists still cannot say with confidence what it was. That alone would make this world feel unfamiliar, but almost everything else about it was unfamiliar too. The continents looked different. Days lasted only 21 hours. The year contained 400 days. Soil had only just begun to form, and most of the land was still a landscape of bare rock, scattered wetlands, and low growing vegetation. In the oceans, armored fish ruled the food chain. Some carried self sharpening bone blades instead of teeth. One of them could bite with a force that rivaled some of the most powerful predators ever to live. And along the edges of rivers and shallow waters, a fish was beginning to develop something extraordinary, the same basic bones that sit inside your wrist and fingers today. This was the Devonian Period, a time often called the Age of Fishes, but one that marked the beginning of something far bigger. The first forests were appearing, the first complex ecosystems on land were taking shape. The foundations of the modern world were being laid down. Before it was over, roughly three-quarters of all species on Earth would disappear in one of the great mass extinctions of the ancient world. In this journey, we're stepping back 400 million years to explore what Earth actually looked like during one of the most important and strangest chapters in its history. If you enjoy videos like this, hit like and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel more than you might think. And let me know in the comments, are you listening to this as part of your evening routine, or is this your first time joining us? Let's start. Imagine opening a geological atlas and turning to a page that no longer exists. The coastlines are unfamiliar, the oceans occupy different spaces, and the landmarks that shape modern maps have not yet entered Earth's story. This is where the Devonian belongs, a period stretching from approximately 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago, positioned between the Silurian and the Carboniferous as the fourth period of the Paleozoic era. Its place in time carries a particular significance. The Devonian stood near the middle of the Paleozoic, an era whose name means ancient life. Looking backward from this point reveals a world still shaped by the aftermath of the Cambrian explosion, when complex animal life diversified across the seas. Looking forward leads toward the age of reptiles and, much later, the appearance of dinosaurs. The Devonian occupied a middle chapter, one in which many of the biological foundations of the modern world were assembled piece by piece. Across much of the preceding history of life, the continents had remained largely peripheral to evolution's main activity. Oceans hosted the richest ecosystems, the greatest diversity, and the most successful organisms. Multicellular life on land existed, though only in limited forms and restricted settings. Large portions of the continental surface remained sparsely inhabited, with biological communities only beginning to establish a foothold beyond the margins of water. The arrangement of those continents differed dramatically from today. Dominating the southern hemisphere was Gondwana, an immense landmass containing the crustal fragments that would eventually become Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, and Australia. Farther north sat Laurussia, formed from earlier continental collisions and composed of what would one day become North America, Greenland, and much of Europe. Familiar geographic features were absent. No Atlantic Ocean separated the continents. The Rocky Mountains had not formed. The Himalayas were still hundreds of millions of years away. The planet's surface followed a configuration that would seem almost alien when compared with the map hanging in a modern classroom. La Roche's position near the equator shaped much of the Devonian environment. Regions corresponding to present day Canada, Britain, and Scandinavia occupied tropical latitudes. Warm temperatures extended across broad areas, rainfall was abundant, and shallow seas spread over low lying landscapes. Sediments accumulated in these settings and preserved detailed records of organisms that flourished in climates very different from those experienced there today. For generations, paleontologists have referred to this interval as the Age of Fishes. The title reflects a genuine biological revolution. Vertebrates diversified into forms that filled rivers, coastal waters, reefs, and open seas with extraordinary variety. Still, the phrase captures only part of the transformation underway. Away from the water's edge, another story was unfolding, one involving the earliest stages of ecosystems that would eventually reshape the continents themselves. Our focus rests primarily on the early and middle Devonian, spanning roughly 419 million to 385 million years ago. During that span, Earth witnessed developments whose consequences would echo far beyond the period itself, altering landscapes, habitats, and the future course of life across the planet. A traveler crossing the continents of the early Devonian would have encountered a surface that bore little resemblance to the living landscapes of today. There were no forests spreading across valleys, no deep rooted vegetation holding hillsides together, and no rich layers of dark earth underfoot. Across enormous distances, the ground remained exposed to the elements, shaped primarily by physical forces that had been working for billions of years. Rain fell onto stone, temperature shifts fractured exposed surfaces, water entered cracks, expanded during cold periods, and widened those fractures further. Rivers carried away loose fragments and deposited them elsewhere. Geological activity never paused, yet the surface lacked the biological communities that now influence almost every grain of sediment on Earth. Modern soil is often mistaken for crushed rock, though it is something far more intricate. A handful of soil contains mineral particles, decaying organic matter, microbial populations, fungal filaments, chemical compounds produced by living organisms, and the accumulated remains of countless generations. It functions as an ecosystem as much as a material. During the earliest Devonian, that kind of living foundation scarcely existed beyond a few scattered locations, near shorelines, along stream margins, and within protected crevices. The first stages of soil formation had begun. These patches were thin, discontinuous, and fragile. Outside such places, large portions of the continental interior remained biologically sparse. The transformation of rock into a living substrate had only just started, and the process was progressing unevenly across the planet. Conditions at the surface presented challenges unfamiliar to most modern organisms. The atmosphere provided less protection from ultraviolet radiation than it does today. Sunlight reaching exposed ground carried a stronger ultraviolet component, creating an environment where prolonged exposure could damage cellular structures. Such circumstances likely influenced the pace at which life expanded across the continents. Evidence suggests that colonization occurred gradually, beginning with organisms capable of tolerating these demanding conditions. Microbial communities established themselves on exposed surfaces long before larger forms became common. Cyanobacteria and other microscopic pioneers formed thin biological crusts that clung to rock, harvesting energy while enduring levels of radiation that would have restricted many later arrivals. The chemistry of the landscape imposed additional limitations. Nutrients essential for growth existed in abundance within the crust, yet most remained locked inside mineral structures. Calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen, and other biologically valuable elements were present, though not easily accessible. Few mechanisms existed for extracting and recycling them efficiently. The intricate exchanges that now occur among roots, fungi, microbes, and decomposers had not yet developed on a significant scale. Viewed from a distance, the coloration of the continents reflected this simplicity. Oxidized minerals produced broad expanses of red, rust, brown, and gray. Rock faces dominated many horizons. Pockets of green appeared mainly where moisture persisted long enough for early plant life and microbial communities to gain a foothold. Those isolated patches stood apart from a landscape still governed more by geology than biology. Earth at this stage was already billions of years old, yet many of the features now associated with terrestrial life remained in their infancy. The continents had form, rivers had courses, and weather shaped the land day after day. The living skin that covers the modern world was only beginning to emerge from the stone. Across the developing landscapes of the early Devonian stood a life form unlike anything familiar today. If a traveler could have looked across a damp floodplain or low marsh, the eye would have been drawn toward towering columns rising from the ground. They lacked branches, leaves, and any obvious resemblance to a modern tree. Their presence would have seemed almost architectural, as though upright pillars had been placed across the terrain by some forgotten process of nature. These structures belong to prototaxites, one of the most perplexing organisms ever discovered in the fossil record. Some specimens reached approximately 8.8 meters in height and about 1 meter in width. During an age when most land plants barely reached the height of a person's ankle, prototaxites dominated the skyline. Many early plants measured only around 30 centimeters tall. The scale difference was extraordinary. An organism roughly 30 times taller than its botanical neighbors occupied a world where vertical growth was still uncommon. Its form was strikingly straightforward. Fossils reveal long cylindrical trunks with no evidence of branches spreading outward. They rose as solitary columns of varying sizes, emerging from wet ground and standing apart from one another. In life, they may have resembled weathered poles scattered across broad lowlands where the first terrestrial ecosystems were beginning to assemble. The scientific story of prototaxites began in 1859 when Canadian paleontologist Charles Dawson uncovered fossils near Gaspé Bay in Quebec. Looking at the large trunk like structures, he interpreted them as the remains of primitive trees. The conclusion appeared sensible. Nothing else known at the time seemed capable of producing fossils of that size and shape. As additional specimens emerged, certainty began to erode. Decade after decade brought new interpretations. Some researchers argued for giant algae, others proposed lichens. A few suggested unusual accumulations of liverwort material rolled into cylindrical masses. Arguments persisted across generations, and consensus remained frustratingly out of reach. A major shift arrived in 2007 when Stanford paleontologist C. Kevin Boyce examined the chemical composition of prototaxites using carbon isotope analysis. The results indicated that it did not behave like a photosynthetic organism. Its carbon signatures differed from those expected in plants that produce their own food through sunlight. Boyce and colleagues proposed that prototaxites function more like a fungus, obtaining nutrients from organic material already present in its surroundings. For a time, the fungal interpretation gained substantial support. Then another complication appeared. Research published in 2022 reported an apparent absence of chitin, a structural compound consistently preserved in fungal fossils from the same deposits. Without evidence of chitin, the fungal explanation became far less secure. Today, the question remains unresolved. Some scientists have suggested that prototaxites may represent an entirely extinct lineage of complex eukaryotic life, one that flourished during a particular chapter of Earth's history and vanished without leaving recognizable descendants. If true, it would occupy a branch of life's family tree, unlike any surviving group. Its ecological role remains partly speculative. Many researchers envision it as a decomposer or nutrient absorbing organism, drawing resources from organic matter accumulating in early terrestrial habitats. Its height may have helped disperse reproductive spores across greater distances, allowing wind currents to carry them above the developing vegetation below. More than a century and a half after its discovery, prototaxites continues to resist classification. Few fossils illustrate the limits of scientific certainty so clearly. Even with modern analytical tools, one of the largest organisms of its age still lacks a definitive identity. Seen from a standing height, much of the plant life of the early Devonian could have disappeared from view entirely. A person crossing one of the damp lowlands of that era would have looked down, not up, to find the pioneers transforming Earth's surface. They occupied the margins of streams, the edges of shallow lakes, and waterlogged flats where moisture lingered long enough to support their fragile forms. These were the first vascular plants, a group that achieved something profoundly important through a deceptively simple innovation. Inside their stems ran microscopic transport networks, capable of moving water and dissolved nutrients from one part of the organism to another. The system was primitive compared with that of a modern tree, yet the underlying principle remains familiar. Water could travel internally instead of relying on every cell being directly exposed to moisture. Earlier plant lineages faced severe limitations. Organisms such as mosses and liverworts lacked efficient internal transport systems and remained pressed close to damp surfaces. Their size and distribution were constrained by the need to keep nearly all tissues hydrated. Even slight separation from a reliable water source created difficulties. Vascular tissue altered those constraints. Plants could now extend upward while maintaining access to water gathered from below. The change may appear modest, though it opened possibilities that had previously been unavailable. Height increased, growth patterns diversified, terrestrial environments became more accessible. Among the earliest known examples was Cooksonia, a plant whose history reaches back into the late Silurian, around 425 million years ago. Its appearance was spare and uncomplicated. Thin stems divided repeatedly into forked branches. At the tips sat small reproductive capsules responsible for producing spores. There were no flowers displaying color, no seeds waiting for dispersal, and no broad leaves capturing sunlight. The entire organism resembled a green framework built from repeated branching patterns. Photosynthesis occurred directly through the stems themselves. Leaves had not yet entered the story. Those familiar structures would emerge later through further evolutionary experimentation. For the moment, sunlight was harvested by the exposed surfaces of narrow shoots rising only a short distance above the ground. Roots, too, remained largely absent. Many early plants relied on rhizoids, thread-like structures that anchored them to the substrate. Rhizoids provided stability and assisted with water uptake, though they lacked the complexity of true roots. They could grip sediment and organic debris, yet possessed little ability to penetrate solid rock or reshape landscapes on a large scale. Where conditions were favorable, these plants often formed dense colonies. Clusters of stems covered saturated ground in patterns resembling living carpets. Their communities occupied places where moisture, mineral nutrients, and sunlight intersected. Within those settings, biological activity became increasingly concentrated, creating localized pockets of productivity across otherwise sparsely inhabited terrain. Their influence extended beyond their modest size. Through photosynthesis, they absorbed carbon dioxide from an atmosphere containing far higher concentrations than today and released oxygen as a byproduct. No single generation altered the planet dramatically. The cumulative effect across millions of years proved more significant. Countless stems, each carrying out the same chemical exchange, gradually participated in reshaping atmospheric composition. The plants themselves remained small, but the consequences of their arrival reached far beyond the scale of any individual stalk. They were laying down systems and possibilities that would support increasingly complex life across the continents. Much of the most important activity of the early Devonian took place out of sight. The stems rising above the ground told only part of the story. A second network extended through damp sediment, mineral grains, and tiny cracks in rock, connecting organisms in relationships that would help reshape the continents. The expansion of plant life onto land is often imagined as an achievement of plants alone. Fossils tell a different story. From the earliest stages of terrestrial colonization, plants appear to have been accompanied by fungi whose fortunes became tightly linked to their own. Together, they formed partnerships that remain among the most widespread biological relationships on Earth today. Modern botanists refer to these partnerships as mycorrhizal associations. In such arrangements, fungi establish intimate connections with plant tissues. Each participant contributes something the other lacks. Plants manufacture sugars through photosynthesis and share a portion of that energy. Fungi provide access to nutrients scattered through the surrounding environment. The exchange benefits both sides, creating a system more effective than either organism could achieve independently. Evidence suggests this relationship reaches deep into geological history. In Scotland, deposits known as the Rhynie Chert preserve organisms from approximately 407 million years ago with extraordinary fidelity. Among the preserved remains are structures showing fungi penetrating plant tissues in patterns strikingly similar to those observed in living species. The resemblance is so close that the basic framework of the partnership appears already well established. For early plants, the arrangement offered a crucial advantage. Their anchoring structures remained relatively simple and lacked the capabilities of later root systems. Accessing nutrients from mineral surfaces posed a significant challenge. Fungi approached the problem differently. Their microscopic filaments extended outward through spaces too small for plant structures to exploit, weaving through sediment and rock with exceptional efficiency. These thread-like networks reached phosphorus and other nutrients that would otherwise have remained inaccessible. Resources gathered from the surrounding environment were transported back toward the plant. Sugars moved in the opposite direction. A continual exchange developed, linking sunlight captured above ground with minerals extracted from the earth below. Such interactions influenced more than the organisms directly involved. As fungal filaments expanded through cracks and plant structures pressed into mineral surfaces, physical and chemical weathering intensified. Rock that might once have broken down only through wind, water, and temperature fluctuations now encountered biological agents capable of accelerating the process. Silicate minerals gradually released calcium, magnesium, and other elements. Streams carried portions of this material away from its source. Rivers distributed it across broader landscapes and eventually transported some of it toward coastal waters. The consequences of that transfer would unfold across immense spans of time, becoming part of larger planetary changes still far in the future. Closer to the ground, another transformation was underway. Dead plant tissues accumulated. Microorganisms processed organic remains. Fungal networks threaded through the developing substrate. Mineral particles mixed with biological material. Layer by layer, the first true soils began to emerge. Soil was not a product of geology alone. It represented a collaboration among living communities, each contributing to a process greater than any single participant. Through countless local interactions repeated across many generations, Earth acquired a new kind of surface. The boundary between rock and life became increasingly difficult to separate, woven together by partnerships that still persist beneath forests, grasslands, and gardens today. Footprints had not yet appeared. No four-legged vertebrate wandered across river margins, and no reptilian ancestor searched for shelter among vegetation. Even so, the land was no longer inhabited solely by microbes, fungi, and plants. Small animals had already begun establishing themselves across the developing terrestrial world, arriving long before any backbone-bearing creature followed. Those pioneers belonged to the arthropods, a group whose descendants still include insects, spiders, crustaceans, and millipedes. Their success on land emerged early. By the Devonian, they occupied habitats that had become increasingly suitable through the gradual accumulation of organic matter, the spread of plant communities, and the formation of the first true soils. Among the oldest known examples is a fossil millipede discovered near Stonehaven in Scotland. Dating to approximately 425 million years ago, it currently represents the earliest known land animal in the fossil record. Its existence places animal life on land deep into the Paleozoic, before many of the terrestrial features we now take for granted had fully developed. Millipedes were well suited to this environment. Feeding primarily on decaying organic material, they participated in one of the first terrestrial recycling systems. As plant matter accumulated and decomposed, millipedes helped break it into smaller fragments, accelerating processes that would eventually support increasingly complex ecosystems. Their movement through developing soils also contributed to the redistribution of organic material across the ground surface. Not all arthropods were decomposers. Predators had already appeared. One of the most intriguing groups was the trigonotarbids, an extinct lineage of arachnids related to spiders but distinct from them. Fossils preserved in Scottish deposits reveal anatomical details with astonishing clarity. Researchers can identify structures known as book lungs, respiratory organs inherited from aquatic ancestors and adapted for breathing air. The presence of these predators tells us something important. Ecological relationships had already become layered. Predation, scavenging, decomposition, and competition were occurring on land long before vertebrates arrived. Small arthropods hunted other arthropods, establishing food webs whose complexity exceeded what the sparse vegetation alone might suggest. Some of the best evidence comes from the Rhynie chert, a remarkable fossil deposit that captured an entire terrestrial community in exceptional detail. Within those rocks appear mites, arachnids, centipedes, springtails, fungi, and plants preserved together, allowing scientists to reconstruct interactions that unfolded more than 400 million years ago. The Rhynie chert also contains some of the oldest known insects. One species, Rhyniella precursor, resembled a springtail and likely spent much of its life among decomposing organic matter. Another fossil, Rhyniognatha hursti, is known primarily from mouthparts, whose structure has attracted considerable attention. Certain researchers argue that its mandibles resemble those of winged insects, raising the possibility that flight may have originated earlier than once believed. Debate continues, and the fossil remains open to interpretation. Viewed from a modern perspective, the scale of this world feels unusual. Mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians were absent. Fish still dominated vertebrate evolution elsewhere. On land, the largest actively moving animal may have been a centipede threading its way through patches of low vegetation and damp sediment. The first terrestrial ecosystems were already functioning. They were built from creatures measured in centimeters rather than meters, yet they established patterns of interaction that would persist through every terrestrial community that followed. Some fossil sites offer scattered clues: a shell here, a fragment of bone there, perhaps a few impressions preserved in sediment. Reconstructing an ecosystem from such evidence often requires careful inference. In northeastern Scotland, however, there exists a place where inference gives way to direct observation. There, an early Devonian community survives in extraordinary detail, preserved with a fidelity that approaches a biological time capsule. This site is known as the Rhynie Chert, located near the village of Rhynie in Aberdeenshire. Its rocks date to roughly 407 million years ago. Among paleontologists, it is regarded as one of the most valuable records of early terrestrial life ever discovered, providing a view of organisms and interactions that would otherwise remain largely inaccessible. Its preservation began with geology. During the early Devonian, the region was influenced by volcanic activity and hydrothermal systems. Hot springs periodically discharged water rich in dissolved silica across the surrounding landscape. As this mineral-laden water flowed through living communities, it infiltrated tissues and filled microscopic spaces before decomposition could destroy delicate structures. The process, known as silicification, operated with remarkable precision. Cell walls, reproductive organs, fungal filaments, and even tiny anatomical features became locked within mineral deposits. Instead of leaving flattened impressions, many organisms retained their three-dimensional structure, allowing researchers to examine them almost as though they had been preserved yesterday. Within these rocks appear some of the earliest vascular plants known in detail. Genera such as Rhynia, Aglophyton, and Horneophyton reveal internal anatomy that would normally disappear long before fossilization. Water-conducting tissues, reproductive structures, and growth patterns remain visible, offering direct evidence of how some of Earth's first terrestrial plants functioned. The Rhynie chert also records biological partnerships. Fungal hyphae extend through plant tissues in arrangements recognizable to modern scientists studying plant-fungal associations. Their presence confirms that cooperative relationships discussed earlier were already established by this point in Earth's history. Animal life appears throughout the deposit as well. Mites, springtails, centipedes, and trigonotarbids occur alongside the plants and fungi, preserving a terrestrial food web in operation. Nematode worms, among the oldest known examples ever discovered, are present too. Rather than isolated specimens collected from different places and times, these organisms are found as members of a single living community. The quality of preservation reaches astonishing levels. Researchers can examine individual cells, identify reproductive organs, and trace internal anatomical structures. In certain specimens, digestive tract contents remain visible. Arachnids preserve the details of their book lungs, allowing scientists to study respiratory adaptations that evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. What makes the Rhynie chert especially valuable is its completeness. Many fossil localities capture organisms after transport, scavenging, or extensive decay. Here, life was preserved close to where it existed. The deposit resembles a biological cross-section through an active Devonian habitat, recording organisms engaged in ordinary ecological processes. Its importance extends even further. Material attributed to prototaxites has also been recovered from briny shirt deposits. These specimens provided chemical evidence used in later investigations into the organism's identity, including the isotope analyses that revived debate over its classification. Without the Rhynie chert, much of the early Devonian terrestrial world would remain blurred at the edges. Thanks to this remarkable deposit, one small corner of that distant landscape remains preserved in extraordinary clarity, allowing life from 407 million years ago to speak in its own detail. If one could descend through the waters of the Devonian, familiarity would disappear almost immediately. The sea remained the center of biological activity on Earth, supporting ecosystems whose structure, inhabitants, and chemistry differed profoundly from those of the modern world. Land was beginning its transformation, yet the oceans still held the overwhelming majority of life's complexity. Many Devonian seas spread across broad continental shelves flooded by warm water. Coastlines shifted gradually across low terrain, creating extensive, shallow marine environments. Sunlight penetrated large areas of the seafloor, supporting communities that flourished across regions now separated by entire oceans and continents. One of the defining features of these waters was the presence of enormous reef systems. Although the word reef remains familiar today, the architects of these structures belong to lineages that no longer exist in their former glory. Tabulate corals formed colonies composed of tightly packed chambers. Rugose corals produced skeletons marked by distinctive internal folds. Alongside them lived stromatoporoid sponges, organisms that built thick, layered frameworks capable of altering entire marine landscapes. Together, they created structures of extraordinary scale. Fossil reef complexes from the Devonian have been documented across what are now North America, Europe, Australia, and North Africa. Their accumulated skeletons eventually hardened into rock formations that survive today as cliffs, ridges, and mountain outcrops. In some places, landscapes visible from modern highways originated as living marine communities hundreds of millions of years ago. The chemistry of the ocean also differed from that of the present day. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations remained much higher than modern levels. As carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, it influenced acidity and altered the conditions under which organisms built shells and skeletons. Marine life adapted to circumstances that would seem unfamiliar to many modern species. Large vertebrates, recognizable from today's oceans, were entirely absent. No whales crossed the open water. No dolphins hunted schooling fish. Sea turtles had not evolved. Even sharks existed in forms so different that comparison with modern species becomes difficult. The dominant vertebrates belong to evolutionary experiments unique to their time. Across the seafloor, invertebrate life reached extraordinary abundance. Brachiopods, often called lamp shells, covered marine sediments in concentrations that continue to surprise paleontologists. Entire stretches of seabed could be occupied by dense assemblages of these organisms. Their shells accumulated layer upon layer, contributing to the fossil record in immense numbers. Elsewhere, ammonites were beginning an evolutionary journey that would eventually span hundreds of millions of years. Their coiled shells drifted through Devonian waters as the group diversified into new forms. Trilobites, survivors from much earlier chapters of Earth's history, still persisted as members of marine communities, although their long dominance was already fading. The ocean contained predators, scavengers, filter feeders, and reef dwellers organized into food webs of considerable complexity. Every ecological role familiar from modern seas had an equivalent, though often filled by organisms unlike anything alive today. Among all these inhabitants, however, one group stood apart. Fish were diversifying at a remarkable pace, experimenting with body plans, feeding strategies, and anatomical innovations rarely seen before or since. The Devonian earned its title as the Age of Fishes because the oceans had become a laboratory of vertebrate evolution, populated by creatures that transformed the possibilities of life in water. Among the many creatures moving through Devonian waters, one group came to define the age more completely than any other. They occupied rivers, estuaries, coastal shallows, reef systems, and open marine environments. Their fossils appear across continents. For nearly 100 million years, they stood among the most successful vertebrates Earth had ever produced. These were the placoderms. At first glance, a placoderm looked unlike any modern fish. The front portion of its body was encased in heavy bony armor, forming a protective shield around the head and chest. Plates locked together to create a rigid framework, while a movable joint connected the skull region to the thoracic armor. This arrangement allowed the head to tilt upward as the lower jaw dropped, creating a surprisingly wide gape when feeding. Their significance extends far beyond appearance. Placoderms belong to the earliest major radiation of jawed vertebrates. Before jaws emerged, vertebrate animals were largely restricted to filtering particles from water or drawing food inward through suction. Such feeding methods limited the range of available diets and ecological roles. The evolution of jaws expanded those possibilities dramatically, opening entirely new pathways for predation, scavenging, and food processing. The feeding equipment of placoderms differed from what most people imagine when they think of fish. Traditional teeth had not yet become the primary cutting tools. Many species instead possessed sharpened bony plates lining the jaws. As opposing surfaces rubbed against one another during feeding, their edges wore in ways that maintained cutting efficiency. The result was a set of natural blades capable of slicing through shells, flesh, and armored prey. Diversity flourished within the group. Some species spent much of their lives near the seabed, crushing hard-shelled organisms. Others occupied the middle waters as active hunters. Certain placoderms remained small and maneuverable, while others reached imposing dimensions. Their body plans varied so extensively that they filled ecological roles later occupied by very different vertebrate lineages. One genus in particular, Bothrialepis, became extraordinarily widespread. Fossils of this armored fish have been recovered from numerous Devonian deposits around the world. Paleontologists often encounter its remains in such abundance that it suggests populations numbering in the millions, comparable to large modern schools of fish occupying productive aquatic environments. Reproduction among placoderms revealed another unexpected innovation. Fossil discoveries from Australia and elsewhere preserve embryos inside adult individuals. Some specimens even show structures associated with internal fertilization. These findings indicate that certain placoderms gave birth to live young, making them among the earliest vertebrates known to reproduce in this manner. Such evidence pushes the origins of complex reproductive strategies far deeper into evolutionary history than once suspected. Their reign endured for an almost unimaginable span of time. Entire mountain ranges rose and eroded while placoderms continued to thrive. Generations succeeded one another across tens of millions of years, adapting to changing coastlines, shifting climates, and evolving ecosystems. Despite that success, permanence remained elusive. Every placoderm lineage eventually disappeared during the crises that marked the close of the Devonian. No descendants survive today. Their armor, jaws, and innovations belong entirely to the fossil record, preserved in stone as evidence of a chapter when armored vertebrates ruled the waters of Earth. Predators had existed for hundreds of millions of years before the Devonian. Seas of earlier ages contained hunters armed with claws, grasping limbs, and crushing mouthparts. Even so, something different appeared during this period. For the first time, a vertebrate rose to a position of overwhelming dominance, occupying the highest tier of the marine food web with a combination of speed, armor, and raw mechanical power. Its name was Dunkleosteus terrelli. The animal is known primarily from its head and upper body, which is fortunate because those regions carried its most distinctive features. Massive bony plates enclosed the skull and chest, forming a heavily armored structure unlike anything found among modern fishes. The rear portion of the body consisted largely of cartilage, a material far less likely to survive the fossilization process. As a result, complete specimens remain elusive, and much of what scientists know comes from reconstructing the missing anatomy. Current estimates suggest that large individuals reached lengths approaching 8.8 meters and masses of roughly 4 metric tons. Those figures place Dunkleosteus among the largest known predators of its age. Some recent studies have argued that earlier reconstructions may have exaggerated its dimensions slightly, highlighting the uncertainty that comes from preserving only part of the animal. Even the more conservative estimates, however, describe a formidable hunter. Its skull reveals why. The jaws of Dunkleosteus operated through an arrangement of muscles and joints that produced extraordinary force. Biomechanical analyses indicate bite pressures reaching approximately 8,000 pounds per square inch. Such values exceed those measured in most living sharks and rival some of the strongest bites known among modern vertebrates. Force alone does not explain its effectiveness. Speed played an equally important role. Modeling of the jaw mechanism suggests that the mouth could open and close in roughly 1/50th of a second. That rapid movement generated powerful suction, drawing prey inward before the cutting plates slammed shut. In practical terms, a fish swimming too close often had little opportunity to react. Those cutting surfaces were not conventional teeth. Like other placoderms, Dunkleosteus possessed sharpened bony blades lining the jaws. Continuous wear maintained their edges, allowing them to slice through armor, bone, and flesh. Fossil remains from Devonian deposits show evidence of severe bite damage consistent with encounters involving large placoderm predators. Additional clues come from unusual accumulations found near certain specimens. Paleontologists have discovered masses of partially digested fish bones associated with Dunkleosteus fossils. These deposits suggest feeding behavior comparable to that of some modern predatory fishes, which swallow prey in substantial chunks and later expel indigestible material. Its distribution was impressive. Fossils attributable to Dunkleosteus, or very close relatives, have been recovered from Ohio, Belgium, Morocco, Poland, and Canada. Such a geographic range indicates occupation of warm marine environments across much of the Devonian world. The species entered science through discoveries made along the cliffs of Lake Erie. In 1867, amateur fossil collector J. Terrell uncovered remains that would eventually become part of the story. More than a century later, the armored predator continues to dominate museum halls and scientific illustrations. Within the Devonian seas, countless animals lived, fed, and reproduced among reefs and coastal waters. Above many of them swam Dunkleosteus, carrying a skull built like a machine and establishing one of the earliest examples of a vertebrate apex predator. Across much of the Devonian seafloor, Life gathered around structures so immense that they shaped entire marine regions. They rose from shallow tropical waters, redirected currents, sheltered countless organisms, and created biological neighborhoods extending across distances difficult to imagine from a single human viewpoint. These were the reefs of the Devonian, and they belonged to a world with no modern equivalent. A traveler familiar with present day coral reefs would recognize the general concept, but not the builders. The dominant architects were organisms that vanished long ago. Tabulate corals formed colonies composed of tightly packed chambers arranged in patterns resembling honeycomb stonework. Rugose corals contributed another layer of complexity, growing as solitary individuals or colonial forms, marked by distinctive internal folds, visible in fossil cross sections. Working alongside them were stromatoporoids, reef building sponges unlike anything alive today. Many grew into large, rounded masses of calcium carbonate, adding strength and stability to the developing framework. Layer accumulated upon layer as generations expanded outward, transforming living communities into enduring geological structures. The scale was extraordinary. Reef systems stretched across broad continental shelves and occupied marine environments for millions of years. One of the most impressive examples survives in Western Australia within the Canning Basin. Today, the reef exists as rock exposed across a dry landscape. During the Devonian, however, it formed part of an immense marine complex, extending for hundreds of kilometers through warm equatorial seas. These formations functioned as more than biological construction projects. They created habitat, cavities, channels, ledges, and protected lagoons offered opportunities for organisms of every size. Small animals found refuge from predators among the intricate structures. Juvenile fish occupied sheltered spaces during vulnerable stages of life. Larger hunters patrolled reef margins where prey gathered in abundance. Cephalopods drifted through nearby waters. Armored fishes navigated passages between reef outcrops. Countless invertebrates attached themselves to hard surfaces, filtering nutrients from passing currents. Food webs became organized around architecture, much as modern cities influence the distribution and movement of human populations. The reefs also participated in planetary chemistry. Every skeleton produced by a coral or stromatoporoid required calcium carbonate extracted from seawater. Across thousands of square kilometers, these organisms collectively altered the movement of carbon through the Earth system. Their growth influenced seawater composition while contributing to long-term geological storage of carbon within limestone deposits. From a distance, the Devonian Ocean may have appeared stable. Reef communities had persisted for millions of years and occupied enormous regions. Their endurance gave an impression of permanence. Yet, ecological dominance often conceals vulnerability, especially when entire ecosystems depend upon a specific set of environmental conditions. The reef builders required clear water, suitable chemistry, and stable ecological relationships. Their success depended on a delicate balance maintained across vast stretches of ocean. Any disruption to that balance carried consequences extending far beyond individual species. By the close of the Devonian, those consequences arrived. Tabulate corals declined catastrophically. Rugose corals suffered severe losses. Stromatoporoids disappeared from their position as dominant reef architects. The immense structures they created ceased growing and gradually entered the fossil record. For millions of years afterward, the oceans lacked reef systems comparable in composition and scale. The architecture that had organized Devonian marine life faded away, leaving only stone remnants scattered across continents as evidence that an entire underwater world had once flourished there. Life shaped the Devonian world, yet every plant, fungus, fish, and arthropod existed within a larger physical framework. Air, sunlight, temperature, seasons, and planetary motion influenced every corner of the environment. To understand the Devonian fully, it helps to look away from the organisms themselves and examine the stage upon which they lived. The atmosphere contained far more carbon dioxide than the one surrounding us today. Estimates for the early Devonian commonly fall between 4,000 and 4,200 parts per million, roughly 10 times higher than pre-industrial levels. Such concentrations strengthened the greenhouse effect and allowed the planet to retain more heat. Oceans, coastlines, and continental interiors all developed under conditions that would feel warmer than those familiar to the modern world. Evidence for this warmth appears in unexpected places. Geological deposits associated with tropical climates occur at latitudes that are now cold and inhospitable. Coal-bearing sediments and evaporite formations discovered in what is presently Arctic Canada indicate environmental conditions very different from those found there today. Regions that now experience long winters once supported climates associated with considerably lower latitudes. Ice played a far smaller role in regulating global temperatures. For much of the Devonian, evidence for extensive polar ice sheets remains sparse. Without large ice caps reflecting sunlight back into space, additional solar energy stayed within the Earth system, reinforcing already elevated temperatures. Climate zones existed, but the contrast between equatorial and polar regions appears to have been less extreme than it is today. Time itself unfolded differently. Devonian corals preserved a record of daily and annual growth in microscopic layers. By counting these bands, researchers discovered that a Devonian year contained approximately 400 days. The length of the year had not changed. Earth's orbit around the Sun remained essentially the same. Instead, the planet rotated more rapidly on its axis. As a result, a single day lasted only about 21 to 22 hours. Sunrise arrived sooner. Nightfall returned sooner as well. This difference emerged because tidal interactions with the moon gradually slow Earth's rotation over immense spans of time. 400 million years ago, that process had not yet lengthened the day to its modern duration. The sky itself may have looked somewhat different. Atmospheric composition influences the scattering of sunlight, affecting color, haze, and visibility. Elevated carbon dioxide levels and different concentrations of airborne particles likely altered the appearance of the horizon. The sun, although familiar, produced slightly less energy than it does today. Stellar evolution causes stars like ours to brighten gradually over billions of years. Radiation conditions also differed. Ozone protection was less developed than in the modern atmosphere, allowing greater amounts of ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. Organisms venturing onto land encountered challenges that extended beyond dryness and nutrient scarcity. Exposure to increased ultraviolet flux imposed additional biological stress on communities establishing themselves outside the water. Weather patterns emerged from a continental arrangement unlike the modern one. Major mountain chains, such as the Himalayas and Rocky Mountains, did not yet exist to redirect winds and influence rainfall. Air masses moved across landscapes organized in entirely different configurations. Seasonal cycles, monsoonal systems, and storm tracks followed pathways unique to the Devonian Earth. Above the reefs, rivers, and growing terrestrial habitats stretched a sky governed by familiar physical laws, yet expressed through conditions distinctly its own. The atmosphere was warmer, the days were shorter, and the rhythms of the planet moved to a cadence no living creature experiences today. At the margins where water met land, conditions changed from one meter to the next. A channel flowing after seasonal rain might become an isolated pool weeks later. Mudbanks emerged and disappeared. Tangles of early vegetation interrupted currents, trapping sediment and organic debris. Across these unstable environments, a different story was unfolding from the one taking place in the deeper seas. Many Devonian waterways were warm and rich in decaying organic material. Plant growth along river margins and floodplains added increasing amounts of matter to the water. Microbes consumed that material as it broke down, using oxygen in the process. During periods of stagnation, dissolved oxygen levels could fall dramatically. Fish inhabiting these habitats faced a recurring challenge that animals in well-mixed offshore waters encountered less frequently. Natural selection operates through small advantages accumulated across generations. In oxygen-poor environments, any adaptation that helped an animal acquire additional oxygen could improve its chances of survival. A fish capable of supplementing gill respiration with access to atmospheric air gained options unavailable to competitors relying entirely on water passing across their gills. Temporary droughts, shrinking pools, and seasonal fluctuations amplified these pressures year after year. Among the inhabitants of these waterways were the sarcopterygians, commonly known as lobe-finned fish. Their bodies differed in an important way from those of the ray-finned fish that dominate modern rivers and oceans. Most living fish possess fins supported primarily by slender bony rays spreading through a membrane. Lobe-finned fish carried a more robust architecture. Each paired fin extended from a fleshy base containing muscles and internal bones arranged around a central axis. Those structures were not limbs. They evolved for life in water and functioned effectively there, yet their design provided mechanical possibilities absent in most other fish. A lobe fin could press against the bottom, brace against vegetation, or maneuver through dense aquatic environments with greater force and control. In shallow habitats crowded with stems, roots, and sediment, these abilities proved useful long before any vertebrate ventured permanently onto land. The geometry of these fins holds particular significance because the same fundamental pattern appears later in vertebrate anatomy. Bones corresponding to upper limbs, lower limbs, wrists, and digits can ultimately be traced back through evolutionary history to structures already present within Devonian sarcopterygians. The connection becomes clear only in hindsight. At the time, these animals remained fish navigating waterways that covered portions of the Devonian landscape. Ecology contributed as much as anatomy. The shallows offered opportunities unavailable in open marine environments. Vegetated margins concentrated invertebrates and smaller prey. Shelter existed among stems, submerged debris, and tangled growth. Large offshore predators were less common in confined waters. Survival depended on flexibility, maneuverability, and tolerance for changing conditions more than outright size. No organism planned a transition to terrestrial life. Evolution possesses no destination and follows no blueprint. Environmental pressures, anatomical variation, and chance combined across immense spans of time. Within the warm margins of rivers, estuaries, and coastal wetlands, certain fish happen to possess traits that fit local circumstances particularly well. Along muddy shorelines and among stands of primitive vegetation, those circumstances were gradually assembling the foundations of a transformation whose consequences would one day extend far beyond the water's edge. Discovery sometimes begins with a prediction. In the summer of 2004, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues traveled to Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic, a landscape of exposed rock, cold winds, and immense distances. Their destination was chosen with unusual precision. Geological evidence suggested that rocks dating to roughly 375 million years ago were exposed there, exactly the age expected for animals occupying the transition between fully aquatic fish and the earliest limbed vertebrates. The search rewarded that prediction with one of the most influential fossils ever uncovered. Embedded within those Devonian sediments was a creature later named Tiktaalik rosier. The word Tiktaalik comes from the Inuktitut language and refers to a large freshwater fish. At first glance, the fossil appeared consistent with that description. Its body carried scales. It possessed fins. Gills remained part of its anatomy. Viewed from a distance, it looked entirely at home among other fish inhabiting Devonian waterways. Closer examination revealed a very different story. One feature immediately distinguished Tiktaalik from the overwhelming majority of fish that had lived before it. Its skull was no longer rigidly connected to the shoulder girdle. A movable neck separated head from body. This arrangement allowed the animal to turn its head independently, an ability common among terrestrial vertebrates, yet absent in typical fish. For an animal living in crowded shallows, the capacity to redirect its gaze without moving its entire body represented a meaningful advantage. The front fins carried an even more consequential innovation. Inside those fins were bones corresponding to the humerus, radius, and ulna found in later tetrapods, including humans. These were not identical to modern limb bones, nor did they support true walking. Their arrangement, nevertheless, created a sturdy internal framework capable of bearing weight. Tiktaalik could brace itself against the substrate, lifting part of its body above the bottom and maneuvering through environments where ordinary swimming was not always sufficient. Additional clues suggest that air played an increasing role in its life. The skull contains openings associated with breathing at the surface, while the rib cage was considerably more robust than that of many earlier fish. Strong ribs helped support internal organs when portions of the body were no longer fully buoyed by water. Such traits fit naturally within habitats where oxygen levels fluctuated and survival sometimes depended on exploiting resources unavailable in deeper channels. Paleontologists generally view Tiktaalik as predominantly aquatic. It was not striding across forests or undertaking migrations over dry ground. Picture a broad-headed predator moving through weed-filled shallows, navigating channels, marshes, and floodplain pools. At times it may have propped itself against mudbanks or submerged vegetation. During periods when water levels dropped, the ability to support its body and access atmospheric oxygen could become increasingly useful. Its importance rests in the remarkable combination of characteristics preserved within a single skeleton. Earlier fish lacked several of these adaptations. Later, tetrapods carried them further. Tiktaalik occupies a position between those conditions, preserving an intermediate stage in physical form. The wrists are especially revealing. They demonstrate that structures later used for walking first evolved within aquatic settings, shaped by the demands of life in shallow water. Within the bones of Tiktaalik, the boundary between fish and land vertebrate becomes less abrupt and more like a gradual unfolding, one anatomical change at a time. Scientific understanding often advances through isolated discoveries. Occasionally, an entire chain of evidence emerges, each fossil occupying a place between the one before and the one after. The transition from fish to tetrapod belongs to that rarer category. Across a span of roughly 20 million years, several remarkable animals preserve successive stages of anatomical change, allowing the transformation to be traced with unusual clarity. The sequence begins with Eusthenopteron, a lobe-finned fish that lived around 385 million years ago. It inhabited aquatic environments and displayed no indication of terrestrial movement. Viewed externally, it appeared unmistakably fish-like. Its importance lies within the skeleton. Embedded inside its paired fins was a pattern of bones consisting of a single upper element connected to two lower elements, followed by a cluster of smaller structures. The arrangement mirrors the fundamental blueprint later seen in tetrapod limbs. At this stage, the architecture existed entirely within a swimming animal. Several million years later came Pandoricthus. Fossils indicate a creature adapted to life in shallow environments, with a flatter body and a skull shape more closely resembling that of early tetrapods. Its eyes occupied a higher position on the head, useful for an animal operating near the water's surface. Certain fins became reduced, and proportions shifted in ways suggesting increased interaction with substrates such as mud, vegetation, and shallow channels. Pandoricthus remained aquatic, yet its body hints at changing ecological pressures along the margins of Devonian waterways. Tiktaalik occupies the next major position in the sequence. Its anatomy combines characteristics previously scattered between fish and tetrapods: a movable neck, separated head from shoulder. The pectoral fins contained wrist-like joints capable of supporting weight. Strong ribs reinforced the trunk. Breathing structures indicate increasing flexibility in oxygen acquisition. None of these features transformed Tiktaalik into a terrestrial walker, though together they reveal an organism operating within environmental conditions that rewarded new forms of mobility and support. By approximately 365 million years ago, fossils from Greenland record a further step. Acanthostega possessed true limbs ending in digits. Fins had given way to recognizable appendages with distinct skeletal elements extending to the extremities. Surprisingly, these limbs appear poorly suited for walking on land. Evidence suggests Acanthostega spent much of its life in water, using its limbs for maneuvering through aquatic vegetation and complex submerged habitats. Evolution had produced digits before producing an effective terrestrial gait. Acanthostega also demonstrates that familiar modern patterns had not yet become established. Each limb carried 8 digits. The 5-digit arrangement common among later tetrapods was still far in the future. Early experimentation characterized this stage of vertebrate evolution, with anatomical possibilities explored in ways no longer present among living descendants. Another Greenland fossil, Ichthyostega, reveals a body moving closer to terrestrial capability. It possessed 7 digits on the hind limbs, a stronger rib cage, and skeletal proportions better suited to supporting weight. Water still played a major role in its existence, yet aspects of its anatomy suggest increasing competence beyond purely aquatic settings. Taken together, these fossils form one of the most detailed evolutionary sequences known. Each species preserves specific structural modifications, transforming a broad concept into a series of tangible anatomical steps recorded directly in stone across millions of years. Some discoveries alter facts, others alter the questions scientists ask. Acanthostega belongs to the second category. For decades, The traditional picture of vertebrate evolution seemed straightforward. Fish developed limbs so they could leave the water, venture onto land, and begin a new chapter in Earth's history. The fossil itself appeared to support that story. Here was an early tetrapod with recognizable legs and digits. The conclusion seemed obvious. Detailed study revealed something far more intriguing. During the 1990s, paleontologist Jenny Clack and her colleagues completed extensive work on Acanthostega fossils recovered from Greenland. As its anatomy emerged in greater detail, researchers noticed an unexpected pattern. Although the animal possessed limbs ending in 8 distinct digits, many features necessary for effective terrestrial locomotion were either poorly developed or absent altogether. The wrist region lacked the strength expected in an animal regularly supporting its body against gravity. Hip attachments were comparatively weak. The shoulder and limb joints showed limitations that would have made extended movement across dry ground difficult. Even the proportions of the skeleton suggested an organism whose body remained adapted primarily for buoyancy rather than weight bearing. Acanthostega possessed legs, yet those legs did not function particularly well as walking limbs. This realization created a fascinating contradiction. If the limbs were not designed for efficient movement on land, why had they evolved at all? The answer appears to lie within the environments where these animals lived. Devonian waterways were often crowded with vegetation. Dense stands of early plants occupied channels, floodplains, and shallow pools. Fallen stems accumulated in the water. Roots and organic debris created obstacles throughout the habitat. Navigating such environments required more than open water swimming. An animal capable of pushing, bracing, turning, and maneuvering through this complexity gained practical advantages. In that context, limbs begin to look less like tools for terrestrial exploration and more like specialized aquatic equipment. Digits could increase surface area and control. Jointed appendages could help an animal anchor itself against currents, move through tangled vegetation, or stabilize its body along the bottom. Features later associated with walking may initially have evolved for tasks performed entirely underwater. The idea transformed scientific thinking about one of evolution's most famous transitions. Land was no longer viewed as the direct target of limb evolution. Instead, limbs emerged through adaptations useful in aquatic settings, only later becoming available for new purposes. Evolution frequently operates in this manner. Structures developed under one set of circumstances can acquire entirely different functions when environmental conditions change. Acanthostega offers another clue supporting this interpretation. Despite its limbs, it retained fully functional internal gills. These were not vestigial remnants from a distant ancestry. They remained active respiratory organs suited for an animal spending most of its existence submerged. The body combined advanced tetrapod characteristics with features firmly tied to aquatic life. Seen from this perspective, Acanthostega occupies a particularly revealing position in the story. It demonstrates that the appearance of legs did not instantly produce a land animal. Anatomical innovations arrived piece by piece, often serving purposes very different from those later associated with them. The limb, one of the defining structures of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, may have originated through the practical demands of life in shallow Devonian waters. Long before footsteps crossed dry ground, those appendages were already at work among stems, currents, and submerged vegetation. A shoreline in the late Devonian did not mark a boundary between life and lifelessness. By the time the earliest tetrapods began spending portions of their lives beyond the water's edge, The terrain awaiting them had already been transformed through millions of years of biological activity. Ground that once consisted largely of exposed mineral surfaces now carried patches of developing soil. Networks of fungi threaded through sediments. Plant communities spread across damp margins. Small animals moved among stems and decaying debris. A new environment had been assembled piece by piece long before vertebrates arrived. Those first excursions onto land likely occurred between roughly 365 and 360 million years ago. The setting was neither barren nor crowded. It occupied a middle state, rich enough to provide opportunity, sparse enough to leave many ecological roles unfilled. Along riverbanks, floodplains, and swampy edges, mats of vegetation trapped moisture close to the ground. Dead plant material accumulated in pockets and channels, creating food sources for decomposers and shelter for tiny animals. Among the most abundant inhabitants were arthropods, mites, centipedes, primitive insects, and other small invertebrates already formed functioning food webs. They fed on fungi, spores, organic remains, and one another. For an early tetrapod capable of capturing them, these animals represented a dependable source of nutrition. Competition remained limited because no established community of vertebrate hunters occupied the same space. Food existed, yet few large mouths were seeking it. Cover existed as well. The vegetation of the Devonian was modest in height compared with later forests, though at ground level it created a surprisingly complex landscape. Stems, branches, organic litter, and uneven sediments produced shaded pockets where moisture lingered. Such places offered protection from drying and reduced exposure during brief movements away from open water. A small vertebrate entering this environment encountered a mosaic of shelters rather than an exposed plain. Predatory pressure also differed from what later terrestrial ecosystems would experience. No reptiles stalked the ground. No amphibian specialists dominated river margins. No land-dwelling vertebrate carnivores had yet established territories. Risks certainly existed, especially from aquatic predators waiting in nearby channels. Yet the terrestrial realm lacked the intense vertebrate competition common in later ages. Viewed through this lens, the movement onto land appears less dramatic than older narratives suggested. Evolution seldom proceeds through bold decisions or deliberate exploration. Organisms respond to immediate circumstances. A food source becomes accessible. A habitat offers temporary refuge. Conditions shift in a way that favors individuals capable of exploiting a slightly different resource. Gradually, those small advantages accumulate. This perspective connects with an idea known as Roemer's rule, named after paleontologist Alfred Sherwood Roemer. The concept proposes that major evolutionary transitions may arise from pressures associated with an organism's existing habitat rather than attraction toward a new one. In some Devonian environments, seasonal drying could have fragmented waterways into isolated pools. Animals able to move between them gained a practical advantage. Land functioned as a corridor linking aquatic refuges. Researchers continue to debate how broadly this explanation applies. Even so, it highlights a recurring pattern visible throughout natural history. Transformations that later appear monumental often begin as local responses to ordinary challenges. The first tetrapods stepped into a world already prepared for their arrival, following pathways shaped by food, shelter, and survival from one patch of water to the next. The turning point arrived without spectacle. No impact scar appeared on the horizon. No mountain chain rose overnight. Across the Devonian world, countless roots were extending a little farther into the ground each season, carrying out a transformation whose consequences would eventually reach every shallow sea on Earth. Earlier plant communities had remained close to the surface, anchored by simple structures that gripped sediment and moisture. During the Middle and Late Devonian, a different strategy emerged. Vascular plants developed increasingly complex root systems capable of penetrating deeper into rock and sediment. What began as a biological innovation soon became a geological force. Rock that had endured wind, rainfall, and temperature fluctuations for ages now encountered a new form of attack. Roots entered fractures and expanded them. Fungal partners accompanied the process, releasing compounds that altered mineral surfaces at the microscopic scale. Water moved through these newly opened pathways. Grain by grain, mineral by mineral, the continents began surrendering their chemical wealth. This process is known as chemical weathering, and during the Devonian, it accelerated dramatically. Silicate rocks released calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and other nutrients as they broke down. Rivers gathered these dissolved materials from broad watersheds and carried them toward estuaries, coastal plains, and inland seas. Each stream contributed a small amount. Across continents, those contributions accumulated into something far larger. A visitor standing beside a Devonian river would have noticed little. The water still flowed toward the sea, as rivers always had. Its cargo, however, was changing. Nutrients that once remained locked inside stone were now traveling through aquatic systems in quantities that earlier landscapes could not produce. The spread of forests intensified the trend. Among the most influential trees was Archaeopteris, a plant that combined characteristics of several later lineages and reached heights of roughly 30 meters. Some trunks exceeded a meter in width. Extensive root networks stabilized floodplains and extended deep into the substrate. Seasonal shedding added another ingredient. Branches, leaves, and organic debris accumulated on the ground, forming layers of litter that decomposed and enriched developing soils. Forests expanded across regions of Laurussia and beyond. Their influence extended well beyond the shade they cast. Every growing season strengthened the connection between land and sea. Nutrients entered waterways with increasing efficiency. Erosion patterns shifted. Sediments moved differently through river systems. Continental surfaces became active participants in global chemical cycling. Far offshore, the consequences were beginning to appear. Marine ecosystems had evolved under conditions very different from those now emerging. Nutrient input can stimulate biological productivity, and for a time that productivity may seem beneficial. Algae multiply, microorganisms flourish, food webs expand. Yet, ecosystems possess limits, and the Devonian oceans were approaching them. The transformation carried a striking irony. Plants were altering the planet in ways that favored their own expansion. Forests generated soil, stabilized landscapes, and reshaped atmospheric chemistry. At the same time, the same processes were delivering extraordinary quantities of mineral nutrients into coastal waters. Life on land had become powerful enough to modify the conditions of life at sea. Without intention, forests were engineering a new world, and the oceans were beginning to respond. A drop of river water entering a Devonian sea carried more than sediment. Dissolved within it were nutrients released from continents that had been reshaped by roots, fungi, soils, and forests. Each river delivered only a fraction of the total, yet countless waterways were performing the same task. Across millions of years, the cumulative effect became one of the most consequential environmental transformations in Earth's history. The process began with enrichment. Phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and other weathering products flowed from the land into estuaries and shallow marine basins. Nutrients are the fuel of biological productivity, and marine microorganisms responded accordingly. Algae multiplied throughout coastal waters, drawing energy from sunlight and converting dissolved nutrients into living tissue. At first glance, such productivity might appear beneficial. More algae could support more life. Natural systems, however, operate within limits. As algal populations expanded, enormous quantities of organic matter accumulated in the water column. Every bloom carried the seeds of its own collapse. Individual cells lived briefly, died, and drifted downward. A continual rain of organic debris settled toward the seafloor, where bacteria began the work of decomposition. That decomposition carried a hidden cost. Microbes consume oxygen while breaking down dead organic material. As more algae sank, more oxygen was required. Water near the bottom gradually lost its supply. In restricted basins and shallow seas, replenishment could not keep pace with demand. Oxygen concentrations fell lower and lower until broad regions became anoxic, depleted to levels incompatible with the survival of many marine animals. The geological record preserves this transformation with unusual clarity. Across North America, Europe, and numerous other regions, late Devonian sediments contain extensive layers of black shale. These dark rocks formed where oxygen-poor conditions prevented normal decay. Organic matter accumulated faster than it could be consumed, becoming entombed within mud on the seafloor. Hundreds of millions of years later, those shales remain as evidence of waters that had lost the oxygen needed to sustain complex ecosystems. Reef communities were among the first major casualties. Devonian reefs depended upon clear, sunlit, well-oxygenated water. Their builders, including stromatoporoid sponges and distinctive coral groups, had flourished for immense spans of time under those conditions. Nutrient enrichment altered every requirement they depended upon. Dense algal growth reduced water clarity. Sunlight penetrated less effectively. Fine organic particles accumulated across reef surfaces. Oxygen levels fluctuated unpredictably. As reef organisms weakened, the structures they maintained also began to deteriorate. Habitats that had supported fish, cephalopods, and countless invertebrates lost stability. Ecological relationships developed over millions of years started to unravel. The collapse did not occur everywhere simultaneously. Different regions experienced stress at different times, creating a prolonged sequence of setbacks rather than a single moment of destruction. This distinction matters. The late Devonian crisis was not one catastrophic afternoon in geological history. It behaved more like a self-reinforcing cycle. Forest expansion increased weathering. Weathering increased nutrient delivery. Nutrient delivery intensified algal growth. Algal growth expanded oxygen depletion. Ecological disruption altered marine systems in ways that made recovery increasingly difficult. Life on land had transformed the chemistry of the continents. The oceans were now responding, and the consequences were spreading through every level of the marine world. A line within a layer of rock in Germany preserves the memory of a world beginning to come apart. Geologists would eventually name this interval the Kellwasser event, after deposits in Lower Saxony where its signature was first recognized. To organisms living through it, there was no single moment that announced its arrival. The transformation unfolded across timescales longer than any lifetime, spreading through oceans that had already been stressed by profound environmental change. The event occurred approximately 372 million years ago, marking the boundary between the Frasnian and Famennian stages of the Devonian. By this point, marine ecosystems had endured prolonged nutrient enrichment, recurring oxygen loss, and the gradual destabilization of reef environments. Conditions that once supported some of the most elaborate biological communities on Earth were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Reefs suffered particularly severe damage. For millions of years, tabulate corals, rugose corals, and stromatoporoid sponges had constructed immense underwater frameworks that organized life across broad regions of the globe. Fish sheltered among their structures. Invertebrates occupied countless ecological niches within their labyrinths. Entire food webs depended upon their continued existence. During the Kelwasser interval, these systems collapsed on a scale unprecedented in Devonian history. The disappearance was neither uniform nor instantaneous. Some reef communities lingered longer than others, while certain regions experienced greater losses than neighboring seas. Even so, the overall pattern is unmistakable. Reef architecture that had defined marine landscapes for ages was dismantled. Survivors persisted in scattered refuges, though the integrated ecosystems that once flourished around them never fully recovered. Other groups also paid a heavy price. Jawless fishes, already facing competition from more advanced vertebrates, experienced devastating losses. Numerous lineages vanished entirely. Across marine environments as a whole, researchers estimate that roughly 40 to 50% of animal genera disappeared. Such figures represent far more than statistics. Each vanished genus carried unique adaptations, ecological roles, and evolutionary histories stretching back millions of years. Afterward, the oceans presented a different face. Deep waters frequently remained depleted in oxygen. Organic rich sediments accumulated across broad areas of the seafloor. Reef structures that once rose from shallow seas became increasingly rare. Communities that survived often consisted of reduced versions of their former selves, lacking much of the complexity that had characterized earlier Devonian ecosystems. The precise trigger remains a subject of active investigation. One prominent possibility involves the Vilu Traps, a vast volcanic province in what is now Siberia. During a geologically brief interval surrounding the Kelwasser crisis, volcanic eruptions released enormous quantities of lava and gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, sulfur-bearing compounds, and other emissions possess the capacity to alter climate, disrupt ocean circulation, and intensify environmental instability already underway. A combination of causes may ultimately prove responsible. Nutrient runoff, anoxia, climate fluctuations, and volcanism need not be mutually exclusive. Natural systems often respond to several pressures at once, each amplifying the effects of the others. Beyond the seas, early tetrapods and their relatives continued occupying river channels, floodplains, and wetlands. They escaped the most immediate consequences, yet the planet supporting them was entering a new phase. The first pulse of the late Devonian extinction had arrived, and the balance that had defined the age was beginning to yield. 12 million years passed between the Kelwasser crisis and the final blow that ended the Devonian. During that interval, survivors persisted in altered seas and reshaped ecosystems. Life continued its work of adaptation, filling vacancies left by extinction and establishing new balances. Those balances proved temporary. Near the boundary between the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, another disruption arrived, one that reached across both water and land. This second extinction pulse is known as the Hangenberg event. It occurred approximately 359 million years ago and marks the formal close of the Devonian world. Rocks recording this transition appear across multiple continents, preserving evidence of environmental upheaval on a planetary scale. Unlike the earlier Kelwasser crisis, whose effects fell most heavily upon reef systems and marine invertebrates, the Hangenberg event struck vertebrate life with exceptional force. Among its most notable victims were the placoderms. For roughly 100 million years, these armored fishes had occupied rivers, lakes, estuaries, and oceans. They had diversified into countless forms, from bottom-feeding specialists to giant predators that ruled open waters. Their lineage stretched across a span of time longer than that achieved by the dinosaurs and longer than many later vertebrate groups. Following the Hangenberg event, every known placoderm disappeared. No branch survived. No remnant population remained to rebuild. Jawless fishes suffered a similar fate. Earlier sections of their story had already been erased during previous crises, leaving only a fraction of their former diversity. The Hangenberg event removed most of those remaining lineages as well. A chapter that had begun near the dawn of vertebrate history was drawing to a close. The consequences extended onto land and into freshwater environments. Early tetrapods, whose ancestors had only recently established themselves beyond the water's edge, experienced a severe reduction in diversity. Paleontologists describe the aftermath as a bottleneck, a narrowing of evolutionary possibilities in which many lineages vanished while only a few endured. Evidence for this decline appears in the fossil record that follows. A striking feature of the period immediately afterward is a span known as Roemer's Gap, lasting roughly 15 million years during the early Carboniferous. It contains comparatively few tetrapod fossils. The scarcity may reflect genuinely reduced populations, environmental conditions unfavorable to fossil preservation, or habitats that remain undiscovered. Whatever the explanation, the record becomes unusually sparse at precisely the moment when vertebrates were beginning their long expansion across land. Marine invertebrates also endured heavy losses. Ammonoids, which had diversified successfully during the Devonian, were reduced to a single surviving lineage. Numerous brachiopod groups disappeared. Trilobites, already diminished from earlier peaks of success, lost many additional families. Across oceans worldwide, ecological networks contracted once more. When the toll of both the Kelwasser and Hangenberg events is considered together, the scale becomes clear. Approximately 75% of species vanished. Around 19% of animal families disappeared. Roughly 57% of genera were lost. Entire evolutionary experiments ended, while others survived only through a handful of fortunate branches. The seas, rivers, forests, and floodplains that emerged afterward belonged to a different Earth. The Devonian, with its reefs, placoderms, and pioneering ecosystems, had reached its end. After the Hangenberg event had passed and the last echoes of the Devonian faded into stone, the world was left with a smaller cast of survivors. Entire ecosystems had unraveled. Reef cities, built over millions of years, had disappeared. Armored giants that once dominated the seas were gone. The future now belonged to organisms that, for most of the Devonian, had occupied the edges of the story rather than its center. Among the most important survivors were the sharks. During much of the Devonian, they existed alongside placoderms, sharing waters with predators that often outweighed and outmatched them. Their skeletons, composed largely of cartilage instead of bone, required fewer resources to build and maintain. Many species were comparatively modest in size, adaptable in diet, and capable of occupying habitats that shifted as environmental conditions changed. When the placoderms vanished, ecological space opened across the oceans. Sharks expanded into those vacancies and began a long ascent that would eventually place them among the dominant marine predators of later eras. Ray-finned fishes also endured. In the Devonian, they represented only one branch of a broader fish world. Their descendants would become the actinopterygians, the most species-rich vertebrate group on Earth today. Every trout moving through a mountain stream, every tuna crossing an ocean basin, every clownfish sheltering among sea anemones traces its ancestry through survivors that passed this evolutionary checkpoint. Their success was not yet obvious. At the time, they were merely one lineage among many, navigating a period of extraordinary instability. Freshwater habitats proved especially important during this transition. Oxygen depletion devastated large portions of the marine realm, yet rivers, floodplains, and inland wetlands often experienced different conditions. Many organisms living within these environments escaped the worst consequences affecting offshore ecosystems. Early tetrapods belonged to this category. Small populations persisted along the margins of ponds, channels, and vegetated waterways. They carried forward anatomical innovations that had emerged during the Devonian, even as many of their relatives disappeared from the fossil record. The period that followed would obscure much of their story. Fossils become scarce during Romer's Gap, creating a stretch of time that remains difficult to reconstruct in detail. Even so, the descendants of those surviving tetrapods eventually emerged into clearer view. From them came amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, and every four-limbed vertebrate alive today. Their survival ensured that the experiment begun in Devonian shallows continued beyond the crisis. A pattern becomes visible when these survivors are considered together. Small body size often helped. Flexible feeding habits provided resilience when food webs collapsed. Tolerance for fluctuating oxygen levels offered another advantage. Organisms tied to fewer ecological requirements generally weathered environmental disruption more successfully than those dependent upon narrow conditions. The losses reveal the other side of that pattern. Highly specialized reef builders disappeared. Elaborate marine communities fragmented. Giant armored predators vanished entirely. Evolution had spent millions of years constructing those forms. Yet environmental change arrived faster than many could adapt. What remained was not necessarily stronger or more advanced. It was adaptable, opportunistic, and able to persist through instability. From those modest survivors, the next chapter of life on Earth would unfold. Far below forests, cities, highways, and drilling rigs lies a record of the Devonian that cannot be seen from the surface. It is written not in bones or footprints, but in carbon. Layer after layer of dark sediment preserves the remains of organisms that lived through the final chapters of that distant age, leaving behind a material inheritance that would one day become deeply entangled with human history. The conditions that created this legacy emerged from the environmental crises already reshaping the oceans. As oxygen disappeared from large portions of the seafloor, normal patterns of decay began to fail. In well-oxygenated waters, dead organisms are rapidly consumed by bacteria and scavengers. Their carbon returns to the environment through decomposition. During intervals of widespread anoxia, that process slowed dramatically. Organic remains accumulated faster than they could be broken down. Each season added another thin layer. Algae settled through the water column. Fragments of marine animals drifted downward. Microscopic organisms joined the growing blanket of organic material spreading across the seabed. Sediment buried these remains, sealing them away from further decay. What appeared at first to be a local ecological disaster gradually became a geological mechanism operating across immense areas of the planet. As millions of years passed, burial continued, pressure increased, temperatures rose within the accumulating sediments. Complex organic molecules were transformed through chemical reactions driven by heat and time. The result was the formation of hydrocarbons, substances that would eventually become oil and natural gas. The process unfolded over spans so long that entire mountain ranges could rise and erode while the transformation continued underground. Many of the world's important hydrocarbon reservoirs trace part of their origin to Devonian deposits. The Appalachian Basin of eastern North America contains extensive Devonian shales rich in organic carbon. Comparable formations occur across western Canada. Reef structures formed during Devonian times later became reservoirs capable of trapping migrating hydrocarbons. Similar geological histories appear in several major producing regions around the world, linking modern energy systems to events that unfolded hundreds of millions of years before the first human appeared. The black shales themselves remain among the most striking geological signatures of the extinction interval. In outcrops scattered across different continents, they often appear as dark bands embedded within lighter rock. To a geologist, these layers function almost like timestamps. They mark intervals when oxygen became scarce and organic matter accumulated in unusual quantities. Their presence allows researchers to trace environmental disruption across vast distances and correlate events separated by oceans. A curious connection emerges from this deep history. Carbon atoms once incorporated into Devonian algae, reef organisms, or marine predators were not destroyed when those creatures died. They entered sedimentary layers and remained locked away through unimaginable stretches of time. Some portion of the fuel burned in modern engines may contain carbon that participated in Devonian ecosystems long before mammals, dinosaurs, or flowering plants existed. The extinction events that ended the Devonian transformed the biosphere, yet they also altered the chemistry of the crust itself. A world struggling through ecological upheaval buried immense quantities of organic matter, preserving a geological archive and an energy reserve that future civilizations would eventually uncover. The Devonian passed away, but part of it remained stored in stone, a hand closing around a cup, a head turning toward a sound, a breath filling the lungs. These actions feel immediate and ordinary, yet each carries a history stretching back to the Devonian. The age of armored fish, sprawling reefs, and the first tentative vertebrates at the water's edge did not vanish completely. Part of it remains present in the structure of the human body itself. The connection begins with the limb. Deep within every arm and leg is a pattern inherited from lobe-finned ancestors that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. One major bone connects to the body. Beyond it sit two parallel bones. Then comes a cluster of smaller elements, followed by digits. This arrangement appears in human beings, birds, reptiles, amphibians, bats, whales, and countless other vertebrates. Its roots can be traced through a succession of Devonian forms, from Eusthenopteron through Tiktaalik and onward to early tetrapods. What makes this continuity remarkable is its precision. The bones embedded within the fleshy fins of lobe-finned fish correspond directly to structures found in later limbs. Paleontologists do not rely upon vague similarities. They compare specific bones, their positions, their developmental pathways, and their relationships to surrounding tissues. The pattern remains recognizable despite hundreds of millions of years of modification. A whale flipper, a bird wing, and a human arm all preserve echoes of that original blueprint. The wrist offers an especially striking example. When researchers examined transitional fossils from the Devonian, they discovered bones arranged in ways that anticipated the wrists of later land vertebrates. Tiktaalik possessed structures capable of supporting part of its weight against the substrate. Those elements were not yet human wrists, nor were they intended for writing, climbing, throwing, or grasping. They were components of an anatomy adapting to life in shallow water. Through countless generations, those same structures became the foundation for every movement performed by the human hand. Breathing carries a similar inheritance. Many Devonian fishes inhabited environments where dissolved oxygen could become scarce. Survival favored animals capable of supplementing gill respiration with air breathing. Organs that help those fishes exploit oxygen above the water surface eventually gave rise to the lungs of terrestrial vertebrates. Every breath taken today depends upon evolutionary pathways that first emerged in habitats shaped by stagnant channels, floodplains, and seasonal fluctuations in oxygen availability. The neck tells another part of the story. Earlier fishes generally possessed skulls attached directly to the shoulder region. Tiktaalik revealed a different arrangement. Its head could move independently from the body, allowing greater flexibility when navigating shallow environments. That separation became a defining feature of later vertebrates. The ability to rotate the head without turning the entire torso traces back to anatomical changes that first appeared during the Devonian. Even the bones of the middle ear preserve this heritage. Structures known as the malleus, incus, and stapes originated through transformations of skeletal elements associated with the jaws of early jawed fishes. Over immense spans of evolutionary time, bones once involved in feeding acquired new roles in hearing. None of these features appeared fully formed. They accumulated through innumerable small modifications, acting upon structures already present. The Devonian survives not only in fossils and rock layers, but in the framework of the body itself. Every movement, every breath, and every turn of the head carries the imprint of that distant world. Imagine standing at the beginning of the Devonian and then stepping forward through 60 million years in a single glance. The continents would seem almost unrecognizable. The difference would not be measured by mountain ranges or oceans shifting position. It would be written across the surface itself in the gradual conversion of bare ground into something alive. At the opening of the period, much of the land remained sparse and exposed. Thin microbial films occupied patches of rock. Small vascular plants clustered near water, rarely venturing far from the conditions that sustained them. Across large portions of the continents, sunlight reached the ground uninterrupted. Wind crossed open expanses with few obstacles. Soil, in the modern sense, scarcely existed. The living world remained concentrated along margins where water and land met. Among the most unusual inhabitants of that early landscape stood prototaxites, towering above surrounding vegetation. Whether viewed as a giant fungus or part of a more complex lineage, it belonged to a world still experimenting with terrestrial life. The interior of continents offered little shelter, little structure, and few ecological layers. Compared with later ages, land resembled a frontier only partially occupied. As millions of years accumulated, those conditions began to change. Plant stems grew taller, root systems penetrated deeper into sediment and fractured rock. Fungal networks expanded through the developing ground. Organic matter collected where generations of organisms lived and died. Each cycle added complexity to the surface. The boundary between biology and geology became increasingly difficult to separate. Floodplains that once supported scattered vegetation eventually hosted forests. Archaeopterysts spread across broad regions, producing trunks, branches, and canopies unlike anything that had existed before. Leaves and woody debris accumulated on the ground. Decomposers processed this material. Nutrients circulated through expanding ecosystems. The land acquired texture, structure, and memory. A fallen branch could influence the next generation of growth. A root system could alter the course of a stream. Within these developing environments, arthropods diversified into established communities. Predators, scavengers, and detritivores occupied different ecological roles. The surface became layered with interactions. Activity unfolded not only above ground, but within it. Burrows, fungal filaments, decaying organic matter, and mineral particles formed interconnected systems that linked living organisms to the substrate supporting them. Vertebrates also began participating in this transformation. Early tetrapods moved through habitats shaped by plants, fungi, and arthropods. Their presence represented another thread woven into an increasingly intricate terrestrial fabric. They entered a world that earlier generations of life had spent millions of years constructing piece by piece. The process was never uninterrupted. Ecological crises repeatedly altered the trajectory of Devonian life. Extinction pulses removed dominant groups and dismantled long-established communities. Recovery followed collapse, then faced new disruption. Progress did not unfold as a steady ascent. It advanced through episodes of innovation, setback, adaptation, and renewal. By the close of the Devonian, the essential framework of terrestrial ecosystems had emerged. Soil functioned as a living matrix connecting roots, fungi, minerals, water, and decomposers. Forests occupied extensive landscapes. Arthropods thrived within established food webs. Vertebrates had begun exploring life beyond permanent water. The planet's surface had acquired a living skin, one that still supports every terrestrial ecosystem existing today. A fossil can reveal the shape of a bone, the curve of a fin, or the arrangement of a joint. Rock layers can preserve the order in which events unfolded across millions of years. Entire ecosystems can be reconstructed from fragments scattered through stone. Even with all of that evidence, one question remains suspended over the Devonian world, difficult to resolve completely. The transition from fish to tetrapod happened. That much is beyond serious dispute. Eusthenopteron, Pandoricthes, Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and Ichthyostega form a sequence rich in anatomical detail. The structures linking them can be traced with remarkable precision. Fins became limbs, skulls separated from shoulder girdles, digits appeared, air breathing became increasingly important. The pathway exists. The deeper puzzle concerns what first nudged a lineage onto that path. One possibility begins within the water itself. Many Devonian wetlands were warm, heavily vegetated, and often poor in dissolved oxygen. In such habitats, any fish capable of supplementing gill breathing with access to atmospheric air possessed an advantage. Survival during seasonal stress may have favored individuals able to exploit the thin boundary between water and sky. Across immense spans of time, small advantages accumulated. Anatomical traits, once useful in shallow pools, became foundations for later innovations. Another explanation focuses on movement between habitats. Periodic droughts could isolate fish populations in shrinking bodies of water. A short journey across damp ground might provide access to another pool, stream, or flooded channel. Under this interpretation, land functioned as a passageway rather than a destination. Limbs, stronger ribs, and improved air breathing would have enhanced survival during these brief transitions between aquatic refuges. A third possibility looks toward opportunity. By the late Devonian, terrestrial environments already contained arthropods, fungal communities, and expanding plant ecosystems. Food existed beyond the water's edge, and vertebrate competitors were absent. An animal capable of exploiting even part of that resource gained access to a niche with comparatively little competition. The attraction was not a grand new frontier, it was a collection of practical opportunities available to creatures already living near the margins. Most researchers today favor a combination of these ideas: environmental stress, ecological opportunity, and anatomical flexibility likely interacted with one another. A fish adapted for oxygen poor wetlands might also benefit from crossing short distances over land. A creature capable of brief excursions could encounter new food sources. Selection would act on each small advantage without regard for where the process might eventually lead. That realization carries the discussion into deeper territory. Evolution operates without foresight. No Devonian fish held a blueprint for forests, reptiles, birds, or mammals. No lineage anticipated cities, telescopes, or scientific debates about its own history. Natural selection responds to immediate conditions. It preserves traits that improve survival and reproduction in the present moment. Viewed from that perspective, the rise of land vertebrates emerges from countless local decisions made by nature without intention. A fin pushed against a riverbed, a lung supplemented a struggling gill. A journey lasted slightly longer, a population endured. Across 400 million years, those accumulated increments became every vertebrate that walks, runs, climbs, or flies today. Some stories become clearer only when viewed from a distance. The Devonian is one of them. After following the rise of forests, the spread of roots, the flourishing of reefs, the appearance of tetrapods, and the collapse that followed, a broader pattern begins to emerge from the details. Across much of Earth's history, extinction is often associated with obvious catastrophes. Asteroid impacts leave scars in rock. Massive volcanic eruptions blanket continents with lava and ash. Sudden environmental shocks create dramatic boundaries in the geological record. The late Devonian presents a more complicated picture. Many of its deepest disruptions grew from biological success. Plants expanded across the continents with increasing effectiveness. Root systems penetrated rock, generated soil, and altered the chemistry of entire landscapes. Forests spread through river valleys and floodplains. Organic matter accumulated in quantities that earlier terrestrial ecosystems had never produced. From the perspective of life on land, these developments represented extraordinary achievements. The consequences did not remain confined to the continents. Nutrients released through weathering traveled downstream. Rivers carried phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and other materials into coastal waters. Marine ecosystems responded to this influx. Algae multiplied, oxygen declined. Reef communities that had persisted for millions of years encountered conditions they were poorly equipped to tolerate. A striking feature of this process is that no single organism caused it. No species intended to alter ocean chemistry. No forest sought to destabilize marine ecosystems. Each plant followed the same basic logic that governs life everywhere: survive, grow, reproduce, and spread. The cumulative effect of countless local successes produced changes large enough to reshape the planet. Viewed through that lens, the Devonian becomes more than a chapter in natural history. It becomes an illustration of how interconnected systems respond when one component changes rapidly. Ecological networks are not static constructions. They operate through balances that can shift as environments transform. Sometimes those shifts create opportunities. Sometimes they eliminate them. The fossil record preserves the outcome with unusual clarity. Reef builders declined. Placoderms disappeared. Specialized groups contracted or vanished. Organisms capable of tolerating changing conditions often persisted. Smaller forms, flexible diets, freshwater habitats, and broader ecological tolerances frequently proved advantageous during intervals of instability. Earth scientists recognize versions of this pattern in many periods scattered across geological time. The details vary from one event to another, causes differ, timescales differ, the organisms involved differ. Even so, recurring themes appear. Rapid environmental transformation tends to produce uneven consequences. Some lineages expand, others retreat. Complexity, built over millions of years, can unravel more quickly than it formed. Care is necessary when comparing distant worlds. The Devonian unfolded across spans of time so immense that no human experience offers a direct equivalent. Its mechanisms belonged to a planet organized very differently from the present, yet the underlying structure remains visible. Life changes its surroundings, and those altered surroundings reshape life in return. That reciprocal relationship is written throughout the Devonian record. Fossils preserve the organisms, black shales preserve the chemistry, forest remains preserve the terrestrial transformation. Together they reveal a world where success carried consequences beyond the scale of any individual species, leaving a pattern still readable hundreds of millions of years later. Numbers on the scale of geological history often lose their meaning through sheer size. 400 million years can be spoken in a single breath, written in a few characters, or displayed on a chart. The mind accepts the figure while struggling to grasp what it truly represents. Human history provides familiar points of reference. Our species has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Agriculture emerged around 12,000 years ago. Cities, states, and written records belong to a span measured in only a few thousand years. The Roman Empire reached its greatest extent approximately 2,000 years before the present. These intervals feel immense when viewed through the lens of ordinary experience. Against the Devonian, they become almost invisible. The Devonian period ended approximately 359 million years ago. More than 1,000 Roman empires could be placed end to end within that interval. The entire history of writing occupies only a tiny fraction of the distance separating the modern world from those vanished wetlands, reefs, and forests. Human civilization appears near the end of a timeline that had already been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. During that immense span, continents drifted across the globe, oceans opened where none had existed before. The Atlantic widened from a geological fracture into a major ocean basin. Mountain chains rose, weathered away, and rose again through later tectonic events. Entire ecosystems appeared, flourished, disappeared, and left only fragments of themselves behind in stone. Life changed as dramatically as the planet itself. The descendants of Devonian survivors passed through repeated episodes of extinction and recovery. Reptile ancestors diversified. Mammal ancestors emerged from among them. Dinosaurs rose to prominence and later vanished. Birds inherited part of that legacy. Flowering plants transformed terrestrial ecosystems. Primates appeared, diversified, and eventually produced the lineage that would become human. Each of these events occupies a chapter within the interval, separating the Devonian from the present day. What makes deep time especially striking is that continuity persists across all that change. The connection is not symbolic, it exists in anatomy. The pattern established within the fins of lobe-finned fishes remained recognizable through every subsequent transformation. One major bone connected to two smaller bones. Beyond them came clusters of additional elements. Digits followed. The arrangement shifted, adapted, and diversified, yet its underlying structure endured. A hand resting on a desk, a bird's wing crossing the sky, a horse's forelimbs striking the ground, and the fin of a Devonian sarcopterygian belong to the same architectural story. The correspondence is visible in bone for those willing to trace it. Deep time, therefore, carries a dual character. It reveals distances almost impossible to imagine, while also exposing connections that remain unbroken across those distances. 400 million years contains more change than the human mind comfortably holds, yet the chain linking past and present never snapped. Generation followed generation without interruption. Lineages branched, contracted, expanded, and persisted. Structures were modified repeatedly, though rarely discarded when adaptation could reshape them. The result is that the Devonian remains present in an unexpected way. It survives not merely in fossils or rock layers, but in living bodies carrying the accumulated inheritance of a journey that began hundreds of millions of years ago and continues still. A manuscript often survives in multiple versions. Early pages contained strange experiments, abandoned directions, structures that never quite worked, and ideas that later generations refine into something more stable. Looking back across the Devonian, the period carries a similar quality. It feels less like a finished world and more like a first attempt at many of the systems that would later define life on land. Its landscapes were populated by forms that seem almost improvised. Prototaxites rose as towering columns across terrain that had scarcely known vertical life. Armored fishes carried bony head shields and jaw plates shaped for cutting long before familiar predator designs emerged. Along waterways, creatures balanced between older aquatic ancestry and unfamiliar possibilities beyond the shoreline. Reef communities flourished under builders whose lineage would eventually vanish, leaving structures without descendants. Nothing about the period suggests permanence. The ecological machinery was also learning through trial and consequence. Plants expanded across continents, roots entered rock, soils developed, and forests spread. Each innovation altered conditions for everything around it. Rivers transported new chemical cargo toward the sea. Nutrients accumulated. Oxygen levels shifted from place to place. Marine ecosystems responded, adapted, and in many regions failed. Growth generated transformations that reached far beyond the organisms responsible for them. From a distance of hundreds of millions of years, the Devonian appears filled with beginnings that carried unexpected costs. The extinction pulses that closed the period removed many of its most recognizable inhabitants. Placoderms disappeared completely. Reef systems that had structured marine life for immense spans of time collapsed. Numerous specialized groups faded from the record. The world that emerged afterward was built by survivors occupying the margins of the old order. Those survivors were not necessarily larger, stronger, or more sophisticated. Many possessed qualities that become important during disruption. Small body size, ecological flexibility, tolerance for changing conditions, and access to habitats less affected by marine crises improved the odds of persistence. Evolution preserved lineages able to continue when stability vanished. From those lineages came everything familiar. The forests that now cover continents trace their ancestry through descendants of early terrestrial pioneers. Amphibians inherited the first steps taken beyond water. Reptiles, birds, and mammals emerged from branches that survived long after Devonian ecosystems disappeared. Every human story unfolds inside a biological framework, assembled from structures whose origins reach back to that interval. Civilizations rose much later. Languages formed, cities expanded, religions, philosophies, sciences, and works of art appeared. Entire cultures flourished and passed away. All of it rests upon anatomical foundations established during experiments conducted by evolution hundreds of millions of years before any human observer existed. That continuity creates an unusual perspective. The Devonian feels unimaginably distant when measured by time, yet intimately present when measured by inheritance. Its traces remain in forests, in vertebrate bodies, in rocks carrying the chemical memory of vanished oceans, and in the shared architecture connecting living creatures across the planet. The story began on terrain that had once been largely barren. Organisms entered it gradually, altered it profoundly, and transformed Earth into a world where land itself became alive. The consequences of that transition never ended. They continue in every ecosystem, every lineage, and every living step taken across the surface of the planet.